Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. Afghanistan's first Vice President Amrullah Saleh has narrowly dodged death after his convoy was bombed in Kabul. In a statement, his spokesman said Saleh was on his way to office when the explosion occurred in the Taimani area of the capital. Police say 4 people were killed and 16 others wounded in the attack. Two members of the Myanmar's military have confessed to Rohingya genocide in the International Criminal Court. In a statement, the international rights group Fortified Rights said the 2 soldiers admitted to killing some 180 Muslims and burying them in mass graves. The troops said their senior commanders ordered them to kill all Rohingya Muslims in September 2017. India's coronavirus cases have jumped to nearly 4.4 million, with almost 90,000 people tested positive, while over 1,100 died overnight. In Pakistan, 9 people have lost their lives to the virus, taking the death toll to 6,359, with more than 299,000 cases. Globally, the virus has claimed over 897,000 lives, while infecting over 27.5 million. Meanwhile, AstraZeneca has halted last-stage trial of its vaccine after an unexplained illness in a study participant. The Arab coalition fighting in Yemen says it has downed an explosive-laden drone over the Abha airport in Saudi Arabia's Asir province. State media said the drone was aimed at civilians in the kingdom's southern area before being shot down. Claiming responsibility, Houthi spokesman Yahya Sarriya said their drones targeted Saudi military and sensitive objects in the airport. News in detail coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. Afghanistan's first Vice President Amrullah Saleh has narrowly dodged death after his convoy was bombed in the capital, Kabul. In a statement, his spokesman said Afghanistan's enemy once again tried to harm Saleh but failed. It said Saleh was on his way to the office when the explosion occurred in the Taimani area of the capital. Police say 4 people were killed and 16 others wounded in the attack. No group has yet claimed responsibility. Now, we are joined by regional political analyst Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai from Peshawar. Thank you very much, Mr. Rahimullah, for talking to Indus News. Today, Afghanistan's first Vice President, Amrullah Saleh, survived a bomb attack in the capital, Kabul. So, Mr. Rahim, do you think it was an attempt to sabotage the already delayed intra-Afghan negotiations?
It has been 6 months or more than 6 months when the US-Taliban peace agreement was signed in Doha. And, the exchange of prisoners and the inter-Afghan dialogue was supposed to start in 10 days on 10th March. It didn't happen. So there has already been a delay, and the Ashraf Ghani government, of which Amrullah Saleh is a part, it has been involved in delaying tactics. And that is also one reason that the talks have been delayed. But let me tell you that Amrullah Saleh remained the head of the Afghan intelligence NDS. He has been a politician. He has very strong views, very anti-Pakistan, anti-Taliban, pro-US, pro-India. So he has made many enemies. He has been attacked in the past as well. So I think that, he is a target. And now that recently he gave some statements which were very controversial, not only in Afghanistan but also elsewhere. So again, I think he became the focus of attention. But I think these plans to assassinate someone, these are made earlier, these are made beforehand. So I don't think that these statements were the real reason why he has been attacked.
Mr. Rahimullah, Pakistan has played an important role in the Afghan peace process, and India has been attempting to sabotage the process, being a spoiler. So how do these Indian attempts can be countered?
You know, if India has a role in this, I don't know, because I don't think the Afghan government will blame India. Maybe it will blame Pakistan or Taliban. But I think that, if someone as important as Amrullah Saleh is killed, then I think the peace talks will be delayed further. Maybe they are even cancelled. So, it's a very critical situation. And that's why the Afghan government has a responsibility to provide protection to its leaders. The U.S. also has a role because it has a military presence in Afghanistan. And, all the stakeholders have to ensure that there are no assassinations, the violence is reduced, and the peace talks should begin as soon as possible.
Right, Mr. Rahimullah, what could be the future consequences of this latest attack in the Afghan capital?
I think it will create uncertainty, it will create concern regarding the, protection, safety of other leaders. I think they will now restrict their movement. They will become more careful. But I think that at this stage, the Afghan government or the Taliban should not further delay the peace talks, because the peace talks are meant to stop these kind of incidents, to make Afghanistan peaceful again. So if they don't talk, if there are no peace talks, and if there is more violence, then I think that these kind of incidents will continue. There will be target killings, there will be assassinations. That's why it's very important to sustain the peace process. And for that, I think some of the important stakeholders, like the Afghan government, the U.S., Taliban, even Qatar as the host of the Taliban Political Commission and the host of the peace talks, and Pakistan being the immediate neighbor, having suffered the most because of the conflict in Afghanistan. They all have to play a role to try to, bring peace and to facilitate the peace talks. I think that, it's a shared responsibility. No one country can do this, and they have to join hands and, try to ensure that the peace process, the peace talks begin as soon as possible, because the U.S. election is upon us. And the result, the outcome of the U.S. presidential election will also negatively or positively impact the Afghan peace process. So I think before the election on November 3, there should be at least some progress in the peace talks.
Absolutely, and we hope that this incident will not affect the intra-Afghan peace negotiations. Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, political analyst from Peshawar, thank you very much, sir, for your time and talking to Indus News. Now, moving on. 2 members of Myanmar's military have confessed to Rohingya genocide in the International Criminal Court. In a statement, the international rights group Fortify Rights said the 2 soldiers admitted to killing some 180 Muslims and burying them in mass graves. The troops said their senior commanders ordered them to kill all Rohingya Muslims in September 2017. The soldiers have provided the names of 17 direct perpetrators from the army, including a lieutenant colonel, a colonel and 3 captains. They claim these officials ordered or contributed to atrocities against Rohingyas in the Rakhine state. Fortify Rights said this is the first time ever that the perpetrators from Myanmar could be tried at the ICC. The group said these 2 soldiers may become insider witnesses. Meanwhile, Pakistan says the UN Human Rights Office has documented a worsening situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir in the last 1 year. In a series of tweets, Pakistani mission to the United Nations said an OIC contact group in Geneva briefed the UN Human Rights Commissioner on the latest situation in the occupied valley during an online meeting. It said the contact group urged the UN Commissioner to continue monitoring human rights violations in the territory. Last year, India illegally revoked the special status of occupied Kashmir in violation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions and imposed a curfew. Since then, Indian occupation troops have killed over 300 Kashmiris and arrested dozens of politicians. Now in Pakistan, 9 people have died from COVID-19 while 426 tested positive for the virus in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the country's death toll is at 6,359. The ministry said over 286,000 patients have recovered so far, so the number of active cases has declined to 6,794. The ministry said the countrywide caseload is over 299,000. Sindh remains the most affected province with over 130,000 infections, while Punjab has reported more than 97,000 cases so far. Now, India's coronavirus cases have jumped to nearly 4.4 million as almost 90,000 people tested positive, while more than 1,100 died overnight. Globally, the virus has claimed over 896,000 lives while infecting over 27.4 million. More in this report.
Hopes of battling the COVID-19 monster anytime soon have been dampened, at least for the western part of the globe. Leading vaccine candidate of the West, AstraZeneca has suspended its phase 3 trials after a volunteer fell ill. But the company says this does not mean the vaccine is off the table. While President Donald Trump promises Americans a cure sooner than they think, the second wave of the virus continues to wreak havoc in India while the country slips deeper into economic strife. Criticism of Prime Minister Narendra Modi grows in the country as starvation pushes people to borrow at hefty interest rates from private lenders.
We lost all work, my husband and everyone else's husband as well. Modi shut down all the means of employment because of this disease, but he can't shut down the hunger, of course. So we took money from Praya's group and started carrying the earning responsibility of the family. My husband was a little unwell, so I had to work.
Greece has joined the list of European countries where the second wave of COVID-19 is now getting a foothold. Australia's sigh of relief over a decline in the cases has been short-lived as new infections spike once again in the lockdown state of Victoria. State's premier has been facing severe criticism over the extension of restrictions and arrests of those who have been violating them.
We'd all like to be open tomorrow, myself included. But to do that is not an act of leadership. That is to cave to some of the pressure that's there, to be driven by the anger instead of the epidemiology, to be driven by opinion instead of science and data and doctors.
South Korea's defiant churches are facing backlash for flouting retractions and becoming hotspots for cluster infections. Meanwhile, Egypt has lifted some travel restrictions and resumed flights to and from Moscow.
Moving on now, the Arab coalition fighting in Yemen says it has downed an explosive-laden drone over the Abha airport in Saudi Arabia's Asir province. State media said the drone was aimed at civilians in the kingdom's southern area before being shot down. Claiming responsibility, Houthi spokesman Yahya Sarriya said their drones targeted Saudi military and sensitive objects in the airport. The Saudi-led coalition has been at war with the Houthi rebels who ousted the Yemeni government in Sana'a in 2015. Now, the group of 7 countries has condemned the alleged poisoning of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. In a statement, the G7 foreign ministers called on Russia to apprehend the people responsible for the poisoning. The G7 statement said the use of any sort of chemical weapons is intolerable under any circumstances. It said Navalny was surely poisoned after a Berlin hospital found traces of a Soviet-style Novichok nerve agent in his blood. Russia denies Germany's claim, saying there is no evidence of the alleged poisoning. Navalny was airlifted to Germany after falling ill on a Russian domestic flight last month. Now, Belarus's embattled President Alexander Lukashenko has hinted at fresh polls amid ongoing protests over the disputed election. In an interview, Lukashenko said he may have been in power for too long. However, he is ready to reform the constitution. Lukashenko refused to hold talks with the Opposition Coordination Council amid calls from the EU for a political dialogue. Meanwhile, the exiled opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya has called for international sanctions against the Minsk regime. Virtually addressing the Council of Europe, Tsikhanouskaya said the regime is violating international norms and human rights. At least 7,000 protesters have been arrested in demonstrations calling for Lukashenko's resignation after 26 years in power. Meanwhile, British police have charged a man with 1 count of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. Police arrested Zephaniah McLeod on suspicion of murder after the series of stabbings in the central city of Birmingham. In a statement, the Crown Prosecution Service said the man was charged after considering the evidence amid an ongoing investigation. The detectives said the stabbings were not linked to terrorism. A man died after being stabbed on Sunday, while a man and a woman are hospitalized in critical condition. The United States Treasury Department has blacklisted 2 former Lebanese ministers over their alleged ties to Hezbollah. It accused the 2 of providing materials and financial help to Hezbollah. In a statement, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said Hezbollah has exploited the Lebanese political system to spread its malign influence. Mnuchin said corruption has run rampant in Lebanon and that the U.S. stands with the people in their calls for reforms. Lebanon has been reeling from its worst financial crisis, and in the latest blow, a massive blast ripped through the port in Beirut last month, destroying the country's main grain silo. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that humanity will be doomed if world powers are not united to curb climate change. In an interview, Guterres said countries must retool their economies for a green future. He called for the nations to use the pandemic as a springboard to launch transformational measures to wean societies off fossil fuels. Guterres said the governments must invest in renewables and commit to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Mexico City's ancient lake Texcoco has re-emerged and taken over the base of a control tower at an abandoned construction site of an airport. Officials have decided to let the swamp grow into a park. More details in this report.
Bright green stalks of weeds are sprouting from the ground where planes were supposed to take off at a New Mexico City airport. Officials are letting nature take over in their bid to transform the marshy swath of an ancient lake into a giant park. Mexico's former president commissioned a British architect to build a futuristic international airport at a cost of some $13 billion. Upon taking office in 2018, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador axed the project after arguing it will be costly to prevent sinking on the waterlogged soil.
El terreno donde se estaba construyendo.
Look at where they were building the Texcoco airport. It was fortunate we called it off. How much was it going to cost us to continue pumping water out of the area? They chose the worst place.
The abandoned construction zone is now part of a project to conserve 12,200 hectares of marsh. Birds glided in a pond beneath columns of crisscrossing steel bars that were meant to become a terminal, greeting some 70 million passengers a year. The steel will be sold as scrap now. About half of that area is slated for public use, including sports and event space, more than twice the size of New York Central Park.
We were thinking it could be inaugurated as a park at the beginning of next year. That's a reality, and it will be able to coexist with other type of activities, to open areas which could serve to walk around in for bird watching, as you can see here.
Officials point to recent flooding as proof that maintenance would have been difficult and say less than 20% of construction was completed. They paid some $603 million to cancel more than 600 contracts.
Now, Iran and Turkey have discussed ways to materialize $30 billion of trade exchanges earlier agreed by both sides. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif says the 2 states had productive discussions in 6th Iran-Turkey High-Level Cooperation Council meetings. Zarif said Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan co-chaired the council meeting virtually. He said the leaders discussed cooperation in the energy, transportation and tourism sectors. An official said the two sides also mulled over ways to help establish peace in Syria. He said other regional issues, including the Palestine cause and hostile behavior of some states, were also on the agenda. Meanwhile, markets in Asia Pacific have declined following tumbling Wall Street shares after the heading COVID-19 vaccine trials hit a snag. Mainland Chinese stocks dropped, with the Shanghai Composite slipping over 1% and Shenzhen Component declining over 2%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index shed almost 1%. Over in Australia, the ASX 200 also saw sizable losses, tumbling nearly 2.5%. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 and the Topix Index fell over 1%, while South Korea's Kospi also slipped more than 0.5%. Overall, the MSCI Asia ex-Japan has shed over 1% so far. And now let's have a look at the weather update across the globe. With the weather update, we come to the end of this bulletin. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Take care.